Good afternoon. I'm Jisoo Kim, Director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. Welcome to the first Soh Jaipil lecture series of this semester. I'm very delighted to have Professor David Fedman with us today. His talk will be based on the book he published last year, Seas of Control, which is the first English language studies of the environmental impacts and legacies of Japan's colonial occupation of Korea. Let me first introduce Professor Fedman. He is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Irvine. He's the author of Seas of Control, Japan's Empire of Forestry in Colonial Korea, published by the University of Washington Press in 2020. And this book also received the AHA Pacific Coast Branch Book Award. And he's the co-editor of Forces of Nature, New Approaches to Korean Environments, which will be published by Cornell University Press in 2022. His other publications include the Ondol Problem and the Politics of Forest Conservation in Colonial Korea, published by the Journal of Korean Studies in 2018. Before I turn it over to David, I would like to ask our audience to submit your question to the Q&A box. I'll make sure to address as many questions as I can after the presentation. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Fedman. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, hello, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Kim for the kind introduction, for the invitation to speak with you all. I was born and raised in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac from your beautiful campus, so it pains me not to be doing this in person, but I do hope that I'll have an opportunity to meet some of you all in person in the not too distant future. I also want to extend a word of thanks to the staff at the Institute for Korean Studies for orchestrating this virtual event. So I am going to use my time today to key you all into what I consider to be 4 of the main arguments and interventions that run through my book, Seeds of Control. Along the way, I'm going to pause to introduce key episodes, events, personalities that animate the account, that illustrate some of these larger points. Before I do that, though, I do want to say a few words about the intended audience of the book. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the series in which it was published, namely the Weyerhaeuser Environmental Book Series at the University of Washington Press. Mine is the first book remotely related to anything Korean to be published in the series, which is geared principally toward environmental historians writ large. And one of the challenges that my editor there, Paul Sutter, put before me was to write a book about Korea that would resonate with the community of environmental historians more broadly. And at one level, that's what I'm doing in this book. For example, there's a robust literature on green imperialism that explores historically the relationship between territorial expansion and the growth of conservationist thought, discourse, and practice. This is a really important body of scholarship that has always struck me as being thoroughly Eurocentric. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to map out an alternative trajectory in the evolution of green imperialism in Asia. Essentially, more broadly, what I'm trying to do is to put the Japanese Empire and the Korean Peninsula in particular on the map, on the radar screen of environmental historians working in other fields. The book also advances arguments about the nature of the Japanese Empire writ large. While it is very much anchored to the Korean Peninsula, it explores developments across the empire, from the mountains of Taiwan to the forests of Hokkaido, Karafuto, and after 1945 into the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. I contend that you can't truly understand or fully understand the nature of Japanese forest management in Korea without looking at the empire as a whole, or what I call Japan's empire of forestry in the Asia Pacific. So these are key components of the book itself that I'm more or less going to set aside today. I do hope that we can circle back to them perhaps in the Q&A. What I want to do instead is to drill down into four of what I think are the arguments that are directed at Koreanists in particular. The first of which is as follows. At kind of the most fundamental level, Seeds of Control is my attempt to dislodge, to dismantle deeply entrenched narratives, both popular and scholarly, of forest ruination, of singular absolute despoilment. The seeds for this project were sown well before I ever set foot in grad school. I've been fortunate over the year to have ample opportunity to hike, camp, backpack, travel through the mountains and forests of Japan. And it was in this context that I was exposed to a relentless stream of commentary about Japan's national forest culture, supposedly timeless traditions of forest reverence and stewardship that stretched back into deep antiquity. Step into any bookstore and you're bound to find titles such as these that invoke this deeply rooted tradition of forest conservation, as evidenced by things like cherry blossom viewing, for example, or as evidenced by the verdancy of the Japanese landscape today. This always struck me as problematic on a number of levels. I mean, for one thing, it's culturally essentialist. It did not align with my understanding of how forests historically had been used, harvested, regrown over centuries in the Japanese archipelago. For another, it always struck me as being fundamentally at odds with my understanding of the role that Japanese corporations were playing at the time over the last few decades in controlling, harvesting, and in some cases clear cutting the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. Japanese timber companies have played an outsized role in the deforestation of Indonesian, Vietnamese, Papua Guinean forests, and that was always lost from in these conversations. So these experiences primed my thinking about how Japan's verdancy at home is connected to its control of landscapes abroad. And those sorts of questions were ringing in my ear as I stepped into graduate school and as I pivoted into Korean studies. Once I kind of worked up Korean language skills to the point where I could read what Koreans were saying about the environmental legacies of Japanese colonial rule, I encountered kind of simplistic narratives of another sort. I encountered almost diametrically opposite characterizations of the Japanese forestry project in Korea that spoke only of deforestation, of extraction, of ruthless harvesting of Korea's natural resources. And this struck me as being fundamentally at odds with the archive itself. As I was encountering these characterizations of the colonial forestry project, I was also finding in the archive ample evidence of Japan's commitment to investment in silviculture, in reforesting the peninsula. So at one level, this book is my attempt to kind of in the spirit of the colonial modernity school, to add a little bit of complexity to these narratives, to recognize that, yes, the Japanese colonial state absolutely clear-cut Korean forests from 1937 to 45 as part of the wartime mobilization of the Korean Peninsula. But that's only one chapter in a much longer and multifaceted story about colonial conservation in Korea that also involves a great deal of tree planting. So essentially what I'm trying to do with this book is to narrate Japan's environmental rule in Korea in a darker shade of green, to recognize that the planting of trees, the greenification of Korea was in and of itself an exercise of colonial power. we tend to think of the greening of landscapes as being this singularly beneficent or benign undertaking. And what I found in the archive, what I try to convey through this book, is a much more complicated story about how reforestation also operates as an instrument of colonial violence, as a mechanism of social control. The greening, the reforestation of the peninsula was a key vehicle through which the colonial state siphoned off woodlands themselves from Korean farming communities into the hands of Japanese corporations and capitalists. It was a mechanism through which the state increasingly set out to control the rhythms and routines of the domestic sphere, insofar as it targeted fuel collection and combustion practices. It was also an enterprise that was ideological in nature. The conservation of Korea's forests was braided into longstanding debates about ethnic and cultural assimilation, about the supremacy of Japan's own traditions of stewardship, and conversely, the depravity of the Korean people and their maladministration of their own forests. So the broader politics of forest conservation and forest regeneration, to me, require a great deal of careful scrutiny. We need to look beyond the surface level to think about how these large-scale plantations and silvicultural projects actually operated as a form of colonial violence. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that the greening to acknowledge that the Japanese colonial state was deeply invested in planting trees is not to diminish the nature of colonial violence in Korea or to apologize it. It's rather to reveal a whole new dimension to the very nature of that violence, of that control. And that's one of the larger objectives that animates the book as a whole. One of the fundamental challenges in writing this book, just as a researcher, was sorting out the rhetoric from the reality, the rhetoric of deforestation, the rhetoric of bald mountains, from the reality on the ground. The Japanese settlers, officials, scientists took every opportunity to draw attention to the scope, the severity of deforestation in Korea. They routinely described it, reduced it to two terms, bald mountains and red earth. And this, as I show I devote a full chapter to this sort of discursive project of the writing of the land, the geographical imagination. This was very much in service of Japanese settler colonialism. It was in their own interests to describe the landscape as being deforested, ruined by the Korean people themselves, so that it could lend legitimacy to their own civilizing mission in Korea. And that's what they did. That's what they did. They wasted no opportunity to draw eyes to the bald mountains that defined the Korean landscape in the eyes, especially of Japanese settlers, but also the international community more generally. That being said, there's no question that the Japanese exaggerated the scope, the nature of deforestation, but their descriptions are not entirely unfounded. We also have considerable evidence that by the turn of the 20th century, significant portions of the mountains and forests that make up over 70% of Korea's landmass were severely denuded. That the Japanese were not totally delusional or fantastical in their descriptions of the landscape, especially in the southern provinces of Korea, where historically population pressures were most acute, where competition for scarce forest resources was most severe. And so I really set out, I'll let you all be the judge of how successful I am after reading the book, to use a wide range of sources to make sense of the actual material transformation of the landscape before, during, and after the period of Japan's colonial rule. It's difficult to understand how landscapes change over 5, 10, 15 years into the past. It's extremely difficult to do so over 50, 75, 100 years into the past. So I turned to a wide range of sources, things like historical photographs, maps, travel surveys, scientific studies, field ecology reports, to try to make sense of this, to better parse the rhetoric from the reality. I also turned to Chosun period sources and the research of Korean scholars who have done much to show how problems with deforestation grew more and more severe into the late Chosun period, especially over the course of the 19th century, when issues with forest administration, with corruption, with monoculture cultivation, and so forth grew more and more acute. So one thing I hope we'll have a chance to talk about is kind of at the level of research, how you actually map out or make sense of ecological change, the transformation of forest cover so far back into the past, how you actually retrieve that and make sense of it from the archival material that we have available. A second core argument concerns the nature of colonial authority and state power in Korea. One of the things that was so striking to me as I set out to research and write this book was the degree to which, the frequency with which the foresters who populate my account, almost all of them, the main individuals pictured here, failed to implement their grand plans for productive, sustainable forests in Korea. Try as they might, as invested as they were in drawing up forest management plans 25, 50, 100 years into the future, they were routinely sent back to their drawing boards as they contended with forces, be they geopolitical, natural, market forces that were well beyond their control. And this struck me as being at odds with my kind of the characterizations I was reading, particularly in Korean language scholarship, of a sort of technocratically efficient colonial state. The so-called ilcheha, this nameless, faceless entity that carries out the will of officialdom with ruthless efficiency. And that is not at all what I saw viewed through the lens of the Colonial Bureau of Forestry. This is very much a story of contingency and of constraint. These foresters really struggled to roll out their agenda, especially from their headquarters and offices in Seoul, as they came to terms with ground level realities. And that's one of the things that appealed to me as a historian about the forest itself. The forest is inherently a lot of different things all rolled into one. Materially, it's a source of timber, of fuel, of different food sources. Spatially, it provides range for hunters, refuge for smugglers, profit for timber corporations. So one thing I hope the reader comes away with from this book is a clearer sense of the wide range of stakeholders that are entangled in the colonial forestry project. And I really try to foreground that over the course of all of my chapters, to recognize that the colonial state itself did not see eye to eye in terms of what these productive forests, what the future of Korea's forests should look like. So some of this conflict that is spawned by these colonial era forestry reforms occurs within the bureaucracy itself. Different bureaucrats in different agencies are routinely at loggerheads with one another. The forest administrators in Seoul, in Kejo, were often at odds with their province level counterparts. Japanese settlers did not always like what the Bureau of Forestry had to say or what they were proposing policy-wise. This comes out, I think, most acutely, finds its clearest expression in the woodland survey, this long drawn out process of woodland tenure redistribution that is drawn out over a span of really 2.5 decades. And this is where those sorts of conflicts about the competing interests in forest use and the different visions for what these forests are and what they mean to different communities comes through the most clearly. There's also a great deal of, much to my surprise, I mean, this really came as a surprise to me as I got deeper into the sources. There's a great deal of intra-imperial conflict involved as well. In the 5th chapter of the book, I explore the disputes between forestry interests on both sides of the Yalu River, especially those kind of centered in Andong, representing Manchurian interests, and Shinwiju, representing Korean interests, who for years and years were battling over the very nature of forest policy, and especially over timber tariffs. We tend to think of different colonial administrations as operating in tandem with one another or being kind of in harmony, moving toward the same set of goals. And that's really not the case when viewed from the Yalu River and from the basin and the forests within it. That was a site of a great deal of conflict between parties on both sides. Now, the woodlands, Korea's uplands, are profitable to think with for another reason as well. And that is that they are spaces of resistance, of insurgency. If there are any colonial spaces that are recalcitrant to the control of the state, it's precisely those placed under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Forestry. Colonial foresters were the front line, the face of officialdom in Korea's rural areas. They were often the first officials, kind of representatives of the state to interface with some of these communities, especially those that lived higher up in the mountains. Look no further than Kim Il-sung, the founding patriarch of North Korea, who staged his insurgency from the uplands of the Taima Plateau, the mountains, these really rugged areas in the northern uplands of the peninsula. There he encountered smugglers, slash and burn or swidden cultivators, so-called hwajonmin, who I want to highlight in particular here. These were people that were living on the edges of colonial authority, and in many cases operating beyond the scope of the colonial state's ability to control their lifestyle, to implement their own set of reforms. The clearest example of this that I explore in much more detail in the book is the issue of hwajon, of shifting cultivation, fire field farming, if you will. This was from the moment Japanese foresters arrived in Korea, they seized on hwajonmin, such as the gentleman pictured here to the right, these shifting cultivators, as the boogeymen of deforestation. Their own lifestyle was anathema to the objectives of sustainable forestry. They were burning through precious resources, cultivating mountains, and thereby despoiling the landscape. And so very quickly, the colonial state, the Bureau of Forestry, launches a wide range of measures designed to combat against shifting cultivation. This ranges from beefing up the surveillance state and policing the highlands to really massive, ambitious measures geared towards sedentization, really kind of social engineering, relocating these communities and anchoring to the land. They invest a ton of money and resources in this larger project of mitigating against shifting cultivation. And to no avail. These shifting cultivators continue to live their lifestyle, and their numbers, in fact, swell over the course of the colonial period, due in large part to the ripple effects of land redistribution policies implemented by the state, to say nothing of the dire straits of the rural economy from the 1930s onward. So try as they might, as deeply concerned as they were with the issue of Kwajalein, they really struggled to contain this issue. And that was a struggle that carried forward into the post-war period and was one of the, at the top of the reform agenda for Park Chung-hee, for reasons that I will return to at the very end of my talk. This is also a geographical problem. Here on the left, we have a map of the distribution of Swidden communities. And as you can see, they're most densely populated in the north. Which brings me to a third kind of set, a third line of inquiry that runs through the book. And that's one concerned with the materiality of modernization. Something that struck me as a graduate student preparing for my oral exams in one field was really focused on colonial Korea was the degree to which discourse had shaped Western English language scholarship on colonial Korea, on Japanese rule in Korea. These are brilliant studies. They're super important studies on things like assimilation, on discourses of civilization and enlightenment. And I learned so much from these studies, but I was really hungry as a graduate student for works that said something about the material implications of Japanese colonial rule, that explored in much more detail what it meant for hundreds of thousands of settlers to move to onto the peninsula to compound already severe scarcity in different resources. What did the growth of urban enclaves, what did Japan's investment in railways mean for the natural world, for the environment? And what were the long-term kind of ecological implications of Japanese colonial rule? That's one of the things I'm trying to address in this book, is to draw our attention to the fact that rail ties, that board sheets, that newspapers, these things that were part and parcel of the Japanese state's developmental agenda were not summoned from thin air. That they were actually born of a complex chain of resource management, use, transportation, and the underlying infrastructure that delivered, that transformed Korea's forests into products that touched everyday life, that were essential to the livelihood, the day-to-day experiences of residents across the peninsula, be they Japanese or Korean, rural or urban. And so the book also, I think, tries to, as best it can, to draw attention to kind of the material underpinnings of the colonial forestry project, but also how it shaped kind of the rhythms and routines of everyday life. This story cannot be told without setting our sights on the Yalu River Basin to the north, the river that forms Korea's border with China and Russia, the Tumen Basin as well. But this is the epicenter, the hub of the timber industry in colonial Korea. I mentioned earlier that the Japanese settlers and officials took great pains to highlight deforestation in the southern provinces. At the same time that they did that, they also invoked this limitless treasure trove of forest resources that awaited Japanese settlers and corporations in the north, in the Yalu River Basin. And it's there from 1910 onwards that the colonial timber industry begins to take shape, headquartered in Shinwiju at the mouth of the Yalu River. So I devote an entire chapter to kind of exploring the development, the evolution of the timber industry, tracking the transport of the incredibly laborious backbreaking labor carried out not exclusively by Koreans, but also by Chinese laborers as well, to map out the geography of transportation that underlied these sorts of patterns of consumption, but also the infrastructure that developed in tandem with it. We think of northern development in the colonial context, principally in terms of the 1930s, when the colonial state begins to invest in the construction of chemical plants, of factories in the north. Well, before those large-scale projects were taking shape, timber industry interests were blazing the infrastructural skeleton on which that larger project of northern development unfolded. So I'm trying to, in this particular chapter, in tracking this industry, I'm trying to put the development of the northern region in particular in a deeper historical perspective. This story can't be told without looking at the flow of timber and timber resources in and out of the Korean Peninsula. As a writer, not so much as, as a researcher, it was confusing, but as a writer, one of the real challenges was this book was to figure out how to communicate clearly to readers the flow of timber resources over time. A great deal of the Yalu River Basin timber actually makes its way northward from 1932 onward into Manchuria. Some of it back to Japan, but Japanese timber is also making its way into Korea. I will not talk your ear off about this right now because it's quite complicated, but I tried in the book to paint a pretty clear picture of the general trends and supply chains that were tying the forestry project in Korea to the rest of the empire. And in this particular context, you have to look empire-wide and really Pacific Basin-wide, because this is inextricably linked to the development of the Trans-Pacific timber trade more generally. After 1920, timber from the Pacific Northwest, from Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, is also making its way into the region as never before. And this is an important piece of it as well. In my mind, however, one particular material surpasses the rest. Surpass probably isn't the right word, but I became, over the course of this project, utterly obsessed with fuel and fuel wood. What is more connected to our everyday lives than the fuel sources that we use to heat our home? And for those of you who have spent a winter in the Korean Peninsula, know very well, this is a major concern of residents of Korea, where winter temperatures plunge, where the winter winds, the low pressure system that makes its way through the peninsula creates bone-chillingly frigid conditions. And so, to my mind, fuel was a really neat way to think about how forestry was something more than simply an industry carried out in distant hinterlands. It was also something that was deeply woven into everyday life and the domestic sphere. So I devote in the book some attention to the politics of fuel consumption, to efforts on the part of the colonial state to render Korean heating practices more efficient. And in this particular respect, the Ondol, the heated floors that are conventional to Korean architecture, is of utmost importance. I decided, as I was revising my dissertation into this book, to actually cut out my Ondol research and publish it as a standalone article, the title of which, the first page of which is here. This is something I explore in great detail in my article in the Journal of Korean Studies, looking at how the Ondol was identified by Japanese foresters and settlers as ground zero of deforestation, how the colonial state set out to reform Korea's purportedly malformed environmental ethics through introducing new fuels, shifting things towards charcoal production, doing away with the sweeping of the forest floor and the burning of pine needles. These were all central pieces of the colonial reform agenda. And introducing, for those of you unacquainted with the Ondol, here's just an example of the technology that essentially repurposes the heat used for cooking, channels it under the floor of the home, and uses it for home heating as well. And in the eyes of colonial officials, this was a deeply inefficient practice, even though they themselves were entirely dependent on the Ondol to keep their bodies warm, their bellies full. So there's a great deal of contradiction and hypocrisy involved in this Ondol discourse as well. They were very quick to denigrate it, but they struggled to come up with a solution. That doesn't mean that they tried. There's a vast number of publications, a great deal of ink is spilled by foresters who have no training in architecture, in home economics, but that doesn't stop them from really zeroing in on the Ondol and trying and setting out to reform and rebuild the Korean household from the bottom up. I explore this in more detail in the article itself. In urban areas, they introduce things like the reformed Ondol. These are newfangled home heating devices that are built into the cultural homes of families that had the resources, the wherewithal to actually incorporate them into their homes. This, of course, was not possible in the vast majority of households in rural areas of Korea. So there, they came up with a much simpler solution, and that was the introduction, at the very least, of Ondol lids. They were quick to identify the open mouth of the agungi as being particularly inefficient, and set out to kind of make sure that all Korean farming households incorporated these, you can see them to the bottom there, these lids, so as to conserve fuel, and that what they were burning within them was more efficient as well. It wasn't pine needles, it wasn't timber necessarily, so much as charcoal, as culm, as recycled agricultural products. And increasingly, this effort to reform the Ondol becomes creates pathways, avenues through which the colonial state begins to encroach, begins to penetrate the interior of the domestic sphere, such that by the early 1940s, when the exigencies of wartime forestry really kick in, they are now promoting a low temperature lifestyle in colonial Korea. They're calling on all of Korean people to conserve fuel for the sake of the emperor, for the course of the war itself. And there's a great deal of Korean and Japanese language commentary that revolves around the household and its consumption patterns operating as an expression, as a sort of metric of imperial fealty. So for me, there was something just inherently interesting about fuel as a material that brought us out of the forests, out of the mountains, and into the domestic sphere. It forces forest historians to think about gender, for one thing, to recognize that the forestry project shaped, in many respects, fell disproportionately on the concerns and obligations of women and children who were expected to collect fuel wood, that foresters targeted cooking, the recipes and caloric consumption of women's cooking patterns. It touched bathing patterns, sleeping arrangements in the home. And so for me, this focus on fuel in particular, I thought was a kind of a nice way to reveal the corporeal and bodily components to colonial forestry reforms that we all too often take for granted. And in the latter part of the book, especially in the final chapter where I talk about the wartime forestry project, I really try to bring to life some of the corporeal consequences of fuel scarcity during wartime, to conceptualize this not just as an issue of scarcity, but as an example of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, a type of colonial violence that we don't often consider because it's not all that spectacular in nature. But as far as the lived experience of colonial rule is concerned, it touched the lives and sensory experiences as much as anything else. Lastly, the fourth main argument is concerned with legacies of this project. These forestry reforms, this multifaceted forestry project that I describe in the book, in many ways outlived the Japanese Empire itself. In some respects, it found new expression in South Korea, particularly under the tenure of Park Chung-hee, who ushered in what Korean scholars routinely describe as South Korea's forest miracle of the 1960s and 70s. As I read up on Park Chung-hee's forest miracle, especially as it was implemented in the context of Samul-Undong, the rural revitalization project, the more resonances, the more connective tissue I saw with the colonial era project of greenification. At one level, there are optic resonances. Park never missed an opportunity to style himself a son of the soil, to preside over these grand pageants of reforestation and conservation, much in the way that the Governor General himself did. But kind of more importantly, there are key institutional and interpersonal legacies as well. I write in the book, I profile one particular Korean forest scientist, Hyun Shin-gu, pictured here to the left, who cuts his teeth in the forestry experiment stations of the colonial state over the course of the 1930s and into the 40s, and goes on in the 60s and 70s to sit at the heart of the brain trust that oversees Park's greenification schemes. And his own research, his own approach to reforesting South Korea is very much informed with and motivated by the same concerns that motivated the colonial state before it. Something similar can be said of institutions of colonial forestry. Pictured to the right here is the Suwon School of Agriculture and Forestry, which was really the flagship institution of colonial era forestry science and experimentation over the course of Japan's colonial rule. Well, it's reinvented. Today, it's in a very different form, operated by Seoul National University, but it too becomes a key institution in figuring out what to plant where and how. I do not mean to suggest here that the greening of South Korea in the 60s and 70s is due to colonial rule. I don't want to draw an equivalency. That's not at all what I suggest in the book. But I do think it's important that we recognize that both regimes were interested in using silviculture, using the greening of landscapes for a broader platform of imposing discipline on rural space. And Pak, like colonial foresters before him, colonial officials before him, did not hesitate to use many of those same mechanisms of social control that forestry allowed him to pursue. This is true of his war on swidden agriculture. Pak succeeds in many of the ways that the colonial state failed to stamp out swidden agriculture, hwajon, from the uplands of South Korea, in part because he really throws military resources at the project of forest management in a way that the colonial state never did. The same can be said for Ondol reform. The untold story of Korea's forest miracle is partly a shift in energy regimes towards the burning of charcoal, introduction of new fuels, and the introduction of new and more efficient types of ondol, those that you see incorporated into Korean homes today. So I want us to appreciate some of these broader resonances that stretch across the 20th century, sort of the same aims and aspirations of environmental governance. These are key continuities, I argue, that animate forest politics across the full sweep of the 20th century. I don't devote nearly as much time or space as I would like in the book to North Korea. Suffice it to say here that North Korea is also, the North Korean leadership is very much invested in nurturing an ideology of forest stewardship as something that binds the people together, and like the colonial state before it, doesn't miss an opportunity to showcase their own green thumb, their own investment in regenerating forests, so as to kind of signal their own benevolent rule to their subjects and citizens. The project of reforestation, one rendered significantly more difficult by the Korean War, another real omission in many ways in my book, is harder to assess in the North Korean context, for access to sources being the chief obstacle. We do know, based on the perennial flooding that we witness in North Korea, we do know, based on the degree to which agriculture has climbed up the hillsides, that it has not achieved the same results that we've seen in South Korea, and that deforestation remains a major issue there. By way of conclusion, I want to, I would really be remiss not to talk about greenification-ism and the growth of empires of forestry beyond the region of Northeast Asia. The green imperialism in Asia remains alive and well. It's taken new forms. It's not at all difficult to find evidence of how Japanese corporations have styled themselves as torchbearers of sustainable forestry, offering sort of an eco-friendly model to development and exporting that to countries across Southeast Asia. From the 1980s onward, the Japanese government and Japanese corporations have really been at the center of a firestorm over questions of deforestation, of unsavory business tactics linked to human rights abuses, linked to deforestation, the sourcing of timber being a major issue, as recently as 2020 with the building of the Olympic Stadium there. What I think is lesser appreciated, and a development that really requires our attention, is the degree to which the same can now be said of South Korean corporations, who are now pointing to, and the South Korean government as well, pointing to South Korea's forest miracle as evidence of their own kind of recipe for lifting a country out of poverty through the greening of its own landscape. And in so doing, have gained access to vast swaths of forest through really concessions and patron politics across Southeast Asia, across Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and elsewhere. I would point you to the most recent dispute in this regard, and that's Korindo, a major Korean corporation that if you would never know if you look on the ground that this is a Korean operation. It's operating under all these different shell companies and umbrella companies, but if you trace the capital back, it's Korean owned, and it's been revealed by a number of NGOs on the ground that Korindo is basically burning through tropical forests in Guinea to clear agricultural land for the growth of palm oil, for the palm oil industry. And this is just one example of many of how South Korean corporations, right alongside their Japanese counterparts, are kind of breathing new life into green imperialism in Asia, and raising questions about how the economic vitality of the industrial economies of Northeast Asia are in many ways outsourcing their material demands, and in some cases, industrial waste to the peoples and communities of Southeast Asia. And that is a phenomenon that I'm hoping to take up in my future research, to really think more fully about the relationship between Japan and South Korea, Northeast Asia and their forests and those of Southeast Asia. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, David. That was just so fascinating. Thanks for sharing your fascinating book with us. I think really, the huge contribution of your work is adding colonial Korea's discussion in the broader, scholarship of environmental history. And I think I would be also interested in really learning more about how that, how your work fits into the broader environmental history, and what kind of discussions, new or interesting discussions that it's adding to. And actually, I have one more question. So it just reminded me of this Shingmogil, right? The planting tree days in South Korea. So this is a national holiday in South Korea, and I just looked it up, and it began in 1949. So it's just right after Korea was liberated from Japan, and I guess this awareness of greenification or forestry project was there from Seungmanri period. So I'm just wondering, interested in learning more about the continuity and how I guess it definitely continues onwards through the Park Chung-hee period. But if you could talk a little more about that kind of continuation from the Seungmanri period to Park Chung-hee period and how like it evolved. That'd be, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as continuity goes, I would go further back. In chapter 7 of the book, I write extensively about Irene Kinenbi. April the 2nd of every year there's a massive countrywide ceremonial planting where settlers and Korean farmers from across the peninsula are enjoined to come out and engage in actively reforesting the landscape, so there is precedent to that, and that I think carries on for 21, 22 years. It's really the centerpiece of the Sylvan pageantry that I write about in the book. So that's not to suggest that that Seungmanri was kind of taking that exact blueprint. There are, of course, important differences to highlight as well. But I think it's noteworthy that the colonial state is just as invested in these sorts of ceremonies and activities that get ordinary Koreans out of their homes and to get their hands dirty so that they can deepen their appreciation of how forestry works and actively express their kind of conservationist commitments. Thinking about the transition from Seungmanri to Park Chung-hee, for one thing, I mean, there are a number of important shifts worth recognizing. One of them is quite simply just the constraints of economic aid that Seungmanri was operating within. Lisa Brady has a wonderful article in the Journal of Asian Studies about UNCRA, the UN Korean Reconstruction Agency, and its own kind of forestry advisors and vision for Seungmanri and for Korea in the 50s. That I think really gives you a clear sense of what Seungmanri was up against. Just the material demands of urban reconstruction itself made any serious investment in reforestation considerably more difficult. I also think the other major factor that is operating in Park Chung-hee's favor come the 1960s is rural outmigration. More and more, I mean, to a really staggering degree, more and more Koreans are leaving the countryside to pursue economic opportunities in cities, in factories. And this is lessening the material strain on forests and giving them time and space to grow. And I would add to that the kind of disciplinary nature of Park's forestry reforms. He makes no bones about timber smuggling, timber poaching being one of the 5 social ills plaguing South Korean society. He taps soldiers to patrol woodlands. He brings the kind of full state security apparatus to bear on the project of forest protection and conservation in a way that Sigmund Rhee never did. And that's also part of the story as well. There are, I mean, I could get into more detail about the energy politics, the introduction of new types of fuels and stoves. But to my mind, it's kind of the broader shifts in the political economy of the 60s and 70s and the forces of urbanization that set the stage for such rapid reforestation under Pak himself. And then, of course, there's the scientific and technological breakthroughs of the 60s and 70s. Hyun Shin-gu is a brilliant forest geneticist who creates the hybrid, the loblolly pine that is introduced in vast quantities across the countryside and grows beautifully to mitigate against erosion, flooding. And so there are also important breakthroughs in science and technology that I also think accelerate reforestation during this period as well.
Okay, great, thank you. I'd like to move on to questions that we received from our audience. Our first question is from Aeong Che. Could you shed some light on the current situation of Koreans living in Japan, particularly with regard to their exclusion from the benefits of Japan's education policies?
I could. I mean, I have a lot to say on that. I'm going to sort of cop out on this question by pointing you to the recent research of Sayaka Chatani, who's doing absolutely brilliant work on this very topic, looking at the marginalized place of Zainichi Koreans in Japan, the ostracism they face, but really putting it in deeper historical perspective to recognize that this is a story that requires us to look back to the mobilization of forced labor in the colonial period and the kind of transformation and identity politics of the post-war period. I'm going to stick more to the topic of forestry today, but if you are interested in this very important topic, I would start by reading what Sayaka, I forget the name of her collaborator, her co-author, but it strikes me as exactly the sort of scholarship that we need to make sense of this topic, but that might also speak to your particular interests.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Haruki Eda. Thanks for your talk. Did you encounter any archival materials that relate to the issues of native versus invasive species of trees or otherwise being connected to the discourse of colonialism?
Absolutely. It's a great question. It's one that actually is alive and well in South Korea today. I opened the book with an anecdote about acacia, the sawtooth oak, which in the eyes of some Korean people, especially older Koreans, it is seen as an invasive species. It still sort of carries connotations of colonial oppression because it was first introduced by Japanese foresters as part of their efforts in erosion control. So there are all sorts of examples of the kind of introduction of non-native species gripping the popular imagination as examples of the kind of enduring material legacies of colonial rule. Where this came up most frequently in the archive was actually in the context of forestry science. I have another chapter, I believe it's the 4th chapter, where I look closely at the operations of the forestry experiment stations in colonial Korea. And one of the things that struck me most in this particular part of the research was how frequently forestry scientists, Japanese scientists, questioned whether or not to introduce the flora of the archipelago onto the peninsula. Early on into the colonial into colonial rule, the Japanese were very much intent on taking the best of Japanese flora and planting it in huge volumes in Korea. They thought that there's almost built into these assumptions were biases towards the inherent natural superiority of Japanese plants. They quickly encountered a different reality on the ground and began to appreciate that, well, not so fast. We need to pump the brakes on some of this. If our forestry reforms are to last generations into the future, we need to also think about how to improve, how to work with the native plants that are native to the peninsula. And I profile a few different experiments and scientists who are really at the center of this effort to figure out what to plant where and why, and also kind of navigating these currents, these biases, the jaundiced eye that that Japanese settlers and officials had towards Korean traditions of forestry, stretching all the way back to the Chosun period. I mean, there's a great deal of commentary about the Chosun state itself and its corruption, its maladministration, and its Confucian foundations being at the heart of why the Koreans had failed to protect their landscape and plant. And so there's a much deeper history there as well.
Great. Next question from Robert Neff. I am interested in the timber issues confronting the Western gold mining concessions between 1896 and 1939, particularly the Oriental Consolidated Mining Concession. These concessions were often at odds with the Chosun government and later the Japanese colonial government. Could you address the conflict between these Western concessions and Japanese timber policies?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I would love to read more about what your findings, your own research. I don't know that I know enough about the particularities of that concession to weigh in, other than to say that there is a great deal of conflict and sort of a scramble for concessions early on in the colonial period, and that the North, the Yalu River Basin, is really a flashpoint in this regard. I, in the book, focus in particular on concession diplomacy from really 1900 to 1905, looking at the scramble and the conflict between the Russians and the Japanese over control of Northern Korea that really took the form of concessions for timber felling rights. And that quickly spirals into, or escalates into, the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. Operating under the pretext of forestry projects are proxies for the Japanese military, for the foreign ministry even. And so this concession diplomacy and these conflicts have to be situated within the broader kind of geopolitical context and contest within the region. So at least as far as forestry is involved, the threat posed by the Russians and the concession that they're granted early on is hugely important to these politics. Now, the relationship between mining in particular and forestry is harder to say. I mean, there's no question that timber is instrumental to any mining operation. You can't mine without a considerable amount of timber. So I have no doubt that there are all sorts of connections and shared interests and alliances, but I couldn't really tell you off the top of my head, at least, what sorts of issues arise or what entities play a major role here. One other thing I want to quickly highlight is that there is an important distinction to be made in the nature of forest governance in colonial Korea. There's the Bureau of Forestry, headquartered in Seoul, that oversees all of the reforms and has jurisdiction over all the provinces, with one exception, and that's the Forest Management Bureau. is created specifically to oversee the vast woodlands of the northern provinces of the Yalu River Basin, and it's its own bureaucratic agency, an entity with its own field stations, and it's created very early on to more effectively manage and harvest the forests of the north. So that bureaucratic distinction, I think, also probably figures into how those politics unfold over the 1910s into the 20s and 30s. They're dealing not with the state and the interests anchored in Seoul, but rather with all of the major players who have set up shop in Shinwiju, which is the beating heart of the colonial timber industry.
That really explains the importance of that northern area when it comes to that. That's so interesting to to know. We have a follow-up question on that topic, I think, from Madison Fallon. How did the timber industry in the north in the Yalu River and Manchuria change with the end of the colonial period?
Well, it changed considerably. Here I'll start by just flagging the work of Joseph Seeley, a historian at UVA, the University of Virginia, who's working on the environmental history of the Yalu River and has a lot to say about kind of the transformation of that region across the full sweep of the 20th century. Obviously, the occupation and division of the peninsula from 1945 onward fundamentally changes the nature of natural resource management. That's one of the things I'm most interested in right now. I'm working on a volume, or putting the finishing touches on a volume on Korea's environmental history. And it strikes me that the division of the peninsula creates all sorts of interesting natural resource management challenges for North and South. All of a sudden, the southern provinces are cut off from access to the main spigot for timber and forest resources. What does that mean in practice is a question that I hope to investigate a little bit more fully moving forward. There's, of course, the relationship between China and North Korea and of the Soviet occupation thereafter that is also governing and shaping the nature of this industry. The Yalu River remains a geopolitical border in Northeast Asia. It's also a heavily militarized, fortified border. The North Korean state has gone to great lengths to ensure that its people are not crossing the Yalu when they're not supposed to. And a lot of the railways, that the sort of infrastructure and modes of mobility that I made passing mention to remain in place. I mean, the Shinwiju is a really important node in the remains an important node in the circulation of these goods. There's really interesting questions about climate change today in the Korean Peninsula and what that means for the Yalu. The fact that it's freezing and thawing in ways different from the past. That there are the Yalu is not just a source of for the movement of timber; it's also a major source for hydropower. There's been really great scholarship done on the damming of the Yalu, the Supung Dam. The late Aaron Moore has an excellent article in the Journal of Asian Studies about what the kind of reimagining of the Yalu as a source of hydroelectric power meant for the other industrial interests that had taken shape. And it posed a major obstacle to the timber industry, really kind of the death knell of the timber industry from 1940 onwards, because these dams and turbines were interrupting the flow of timber down the Yalu itself. So I think it's also important to recognize in thinking long-term about that particular watershed that kind of the changing interests and imperatives of regional development have also played a major role, particularly in the context of energy production.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I wonder, that question that you mentioned, how that, divided Korea impacted southern part of Korea, being excluded from that timber industry from the north. And it would be really interesting to see, its impact. And also, I wonder how, to what extent also, Korean War had impacted the northern part
Oh
area.
yeah, yeah. I mean, majorly. I don't know enough yet to really weigh in, but that's another important point to just highlight here, that the Japanese occupation of Korea and the mobilization of the peninsula to kind of stage the war in Northeast Asia, in northeastern China, causes all sorts of ecological problems. It exhausts Korea's forest resources, but it's still a staging ground. The Korean War, by contrast, is fought in and around the forests themselves, which are subjected to phosphorus and incendiary bombing campaigns. It's active battle space itself, to say nothing of the displacement of refugees caused by the war, who, out of desperation for survival, were quick to hack down whatever they could for fuel sources and to build shanties. So I don't think you can overstate the damage wrought on the Korean landscape by the Korean War itself, which makes it kind of doubly disappointing that I don't explore that in any real depth in the book itself. But I do hope to return to it. We address it in this edited volume that's forthcoming. My colleague here at UC Irvine, Alina Kim, is about to publish a beautiful book on the greening of the DMZ, thinking about kind of how ideas about the demilitarized zone and the actual space itself have played into the politics of unification, and how the greening of the DMZ itself shapes how we remember and forget the Korean War. So I strongly suspect, I haven't read the book yet, but that there's a lot more to be said on the topic, and that Alina will take some of that up.
Wonderful. A lot of interesting works coming out. So next question by Eugene Chang. I was quite surprised to find out that the use of Ondol was initially controversial, because from my understanding, it serves two functions at the same time, which is heating up the cooking tool and the whole house. Would you revisit some of the reasons why the use of Ondol was initially controversial, and how the discussion led to its reform?
Sure. It's a great question. Not to beat a dead horse here, but if you're really interested,
Read the article.
pick up your 2018 version volume of Journal of Korean Studies, where I really take a deep dive on this. But you're absolutely right to point out that in some ways, on its face, the Ondol seems awfully efficient insofar as it repurposes heat used for cooking to heat the home itself. That didn't change how the Japanese officials, scientists, settlers, architects denigrated the Ondol on many different criteria. For one thing, the so-called Ondol lifestyle was braided into longstanding discourses about Korean sloth and hygiene. That the Ondol it made the home too hot, thereby nurturing in the Korean character a tendency towards hibernation. And that if the country was to lift itself up by the bootstraps and modernize under Japanese tutelage, that they would need to more efficiently regulate home temperatures to get those slumbering bodies off the Ondol floor and into the fields and into the factories. And something similar can be said of hygiene. The Ondol was tied to broader discourses that Todd Henry has done a great job bringing to light about kind of hygienic practices of the Korean people that were used to other them, that were used to uphold Japan's kind of place atop the civilizational hierarchy of colonial society. So there's that piece of it, just the degree to which it's kind of becomes a cultural touchstone for commentary on the very nature of Koreanness. But then there's the actual practices involved in the use of the Ondol. And this is where the foresters really come into play. The architects are saying things about the aesthetics of the home, the spatial arrangement. For the foresters, it's the Ondol is one thing. What's being burned in the Ondol is the real problem. And so the foresters are chiefly concerned with instructing Korean women, young and old, in efficient fuel collection and combustion practices. They observe through a wide range of ethnographic research a tendency of Korean farming households to go out into the forests and to rake up fuel from the forest floor. And you see images of this over and over again. Boy gathering fuel, boy gathering grass. It's in Western kind of Orientalist writings about Korea. It's in Japanese surveys about Korea. And from an ecological perspective, from a forest management perspective, this is deeply problematic. It's taking up all that nutrient-rich detritus that is absolutely essential to long-term forest health and burning it in one fell swoop without any regard for the thinning of the forest and sustainability. So for them, the issue is not just the Ondol, it's associated fuel collection practices and the markets themselves. The fact that a lot of the fuel is being raked up and loaded onto oxen and taken into urban fuel markets without any real regard for sustainable burning practices. And the burning of pine needles being another major practice that they do not like. And for good reason, thermodynamically speaking, that's not very efficient. So they're all about introducing new types of fuel. I mentioned charcoal, culm, rice husks, these and charcoal briquettes even. These and other fuel sources are introduced, or at least they try to introduce them, in part to gain greater control over the fuel market itself, to make sure that these fuels, that what they wanted to stay in the forest stayed in the forest and wasn't sold in black market fuel markets. So, I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question. Believe it or not, I have a lot more to say on this topic. But that should give you a sense of some of the grounds on which the Ondol is attacked or marked as ground zero of deforestation. All that being said, it doesn't go away. The Japanese settlers, foresters themselves are entirely dependent on the Ondol and are very quickly, by the 1920s and 30s, begin to rein in their criticism of the Ondol. And some settlers, if you go back and look at settler writing, have a deep nostalgia for the Ondol and see an affinity between Japan, just as the Japanese sit atop tatami, the Koreans sit atop Ondol, and that's a source of shared floor-sitting culture that actually nurtures fraternity between both societies. This is a common line you'll see in contemporary writings. It's a very complicated topic, which is why I was drawn to it. I actually got trapped under a Korean home my second year of grad school because I went in to inspect the Ondol and climbed into the mouth of the Ondol of a historically preserved home. And word to the wise, it's a lot easier to get under a Korean home than it is to get out of a Korean home. So I had to get help called and a fire department called to get me out from beneath an Ondol floor.
Wow, what experience. You're such a diligent researcher.
Well, I wouldn't recommend that.
Okay. All right. Next question from Chin-Sung Kim. He's asking, I've heard that a lot of false acacia trees in Korean, acacia namu, were planted for reforestation under the park government. I wonder if this is true and if the Japanese Empire also encouraged to plant the trees.
I recommend reading the book. That is exactly how my entry point into this whole topic. I open with a vignette about the efforts by contemporary South Koreans to remove, to scrub the mountains of the traces of the material traces of Japanese colonial rule by chopping down and uprooting acacia trees. In their eyes, these trees are reminiscent of, are expressions of colonialism. The reality is exactly as you point out, that the vast majority of acacia today were introduced by Pak Chung-hee. And that to me was just, when I was in the field and saw this unfold, it just hit me across the head. Like, this is just too interesting not to investigate further. The fact that there's this kind of a very selective public memory or consciousness surrounding this tree that associates it with one thing, but really doesn't pay much attention to the full sweep, this important continuity in why these trees were planted in the first place. So to answer your question more directly, yes, the Japanese planted acacia in very large volumes, and that for the very same reasons that the Japanese did, Pak and his reforestation advisors introduce false acacia in the 60s, but especially in the 1970s.
Great. I think this will be the last question from Elliot Cha. Are there any resources to learn more about the green governmentality and the growth of Korean environmental history for those who are interested?
I mean, it's almost as if I paid you to set up a plug for this edited volume that is about to come out. I would start with Forces of Nature, New Approaches to Korean Environments. It'll be out in late 2022, I believe, from Cornell University Press. And this was kind of the product of me sitting down with a few friends and colleagues and recognizing that the field of Korean environmental history is about to explode. Like, I mean, just in the course of our conversation today, I've mentioned 5 or 6 different authors and writers, and there are many more than that. So the field of Korean environmental history is there's a lot of energy behind it, and I'd say over the next 5-10 years, we're about to see a significant expansion in the English language literature we have to consult. So this volume was an effort to bring together a lot of those historians, and it is interdisciplinary in nature. It's not just historians. We have essays by anthropologists, by film studies scholars, agronomists even. So our hope is that is kind of a entry point into this. As far as resources beyond that, I can't really think of anything comparable that's in English. If we're talking about Korean language sources, there's more stuff. There is now, as recently I think as 2015, there's now a Korean Society for Environmental History. There's a Korean language journal dedicated to Korean environmental history. So it's also taking root in Korean academia itself. So if you are a reader of Korean, there's a lot of wonderful scholarship out there that's only going to grow and grow over the coming years.
Yeah, it sounds a very important book that'll be coming out, your edited volume. Does it primarily focus on the 20th century?
It does not. No, we have, I think, 3 chapters on Korea's pre-industrial environmental history. Sua McCormick has a chapter about pottery and ceramic culture, how it was affected in Chosun, Korea by the Little Ice Age, by changes in climate affecting access to fuel sources and how that found expression in the material culture of Chosun society. John Lee has a chapter about the Mongol invasion of Korea and its ecological legacies. So we are trying to kind of address the full sweep of Korea's environmental history as best we can in a relatively compact volume.
Wonderful. I can't wait to read this. Yeah, maybe I would like to ask one last question. So you know your work is basically challenging this the conventional narrative in Korea. So the Korean nationalist narrative about this deforestation during colonial Korea. So I'm just wondering, I'm sure you must have presented in Korea as well, or have been in dialogue with scholars in Korea. So how are they perceiving this this new argument that you're?
It really depends on the audience. There are some groups of Korean scholars who are much more amenable to this than others. So some of my own scholarship has been influenced in part by scholars at the Naksongdae Institute. And they seem to be much more open-minded to the idea that the colonial forestry wasn't only about oppression. Of course, there's a whole political project there that we need not get bogged down in here. I can't say I've gotten considerable pushback from scholars, in part because I, as a grad student, was struggling to articulate exactly what it was that I was up to. But the suggestion, the insinuation in the last part of my book that South Korea is engaged in green imperialism in its own right has invited some considerable pushback. And as I understand where it comes from, but the more I look at what's happening on the ground in Southeast Asia, the harder it is to ignore South Korea's place within it. And so I remain undeterred in making that argument. But so far, I can't say that I've received a great deal of vitriol or criticism. We're in talks now to have the book translated into Korean. I sincerely hope that comes to fruition, and in which case I imagine there will be a lot more dialogue along those lines.
Sure. I'm sure, yeah, once it's translated into Korean and published there, most scholars, I'm sure, in this field will read it and cite your work. All right, thank you so much, David. This has been such a wonderful presentation and talking about really, environmental history in Korea, which is really, I think, emerging and really becoming a hot field. So thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for staying with us until the end. I hope you've enjoyed our first Soh Jaipil lecture of the year, academic year. I hope to see you again, and thank you, everyone. And thanks, Sean and Kim, for hosting this virtual event.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, David.